This is The Art of Plenty, a podcast that inspires and encourages individuals to live their best life, to be the person that they were meant to be. My name is Amy McInnes. I am a mother of 5. I am a registered clinical counselor. I am an entrepreneur. And I am a person who has struggled with anxiety and who used to have a panic disorder. And that is today's topic. And it makes me feel incredibly uncomfortable. And the reason for that is I'm not used to talking about that experience in my life. I'm one of those people who, when I've come through something and I feel like I am beyond it, I'm happy to share the experience because I feel like I'm no longer that person. But I struggled with anxiety for so long and have had it show up in waves and in blips throughout my entire life that it's something that I don't really like to talk about. Because can we just acknowledge how awful feeling anxious is and how awful it is to have a panic attack? If your brain isn't wired that way, if you are not a person who gets anxious, it can be hard to understand and it can be hard to recognize what's going on. I know when I was really struggling and it was full on for me when I was experiencing this, it was difficult for my husband to really understand. He is not an anxious person. He doesn't even go there. Like, his mind doesn't even think about things like that. Not that he doesn't get stressed or anxious. It's just, it was so foreign to him at that time. And it was difficult to describe what was going on for me. And I think it was hard for him to have patience with me, especially because one of the things that happens to me when I get super anxious is my tolerance for things drops, which means I can be upset or annoyed or irritated very quickly to things that wouldn't normally bother me or wouldn't normally get me worked up. So if my anxiety level is higher, I have a really short fuse. And it's not that I respond in anger, it's that I respond irritably, I don't have patience, and I can get frustrated about things that normally wouldn't bother me. And that is really difficult to live with. So if you are in a relationship with somebody who has or is experiencing a lot of anxiety, it's super difficult. Like I just have so much gratitude and thankfulness towards Jody for living with me when I was going through that, because I couldn't even connect all of the irritability and the need to control to the experiences that I was having with anxiety. Because when I was experiencing the anxiety and feeling anxious, that wasn't the time that I was being irritable or short or controlling. It's that because that was happening in my life, I felt like I was trying to control all the other parts as a way to be okay. I really want to differentiate stress from anxiety. Even as a counselor, these are terms that I use interchangeably all the time. And I just feel like we need to have a little bit of reference for what we're talking about. So stress is an outside situation or something that is coming towards us or putting pressure on us. That is the stress. And regardless of who you are, regardless of where you're at in your life, you are experiencing stress or have experienced stress at some point. And the things that cause us stress or the things that are stressful aren't always bad. These can be amazing things like a new job, like getting married, like having a baby, like moving into a new house. These are all situations of stress. Anxiety is how we respond to situations. And we can have anxiety even if we're not in a high stress situation. And people that are in a high stress situation don't necessarily respond with anxiety. And I want to draw that out because anxiety is so bizarre. I want to tell you what caused my panic. I can't even, even now, even though I haven't experienced panic for probably a decade in that way, that I don't think I've actually even had a panic attack. Actually, you know what? That's not true. The day that I got diagnosed with cancer, that night when I went to bed, I had a panic attack. But that's the only panic attack that I think I've had in a decade. And the decade prior to that, I had them all the time. Let me tell you where the panic came from. I think all my late childhood, adolescence, I struggled with anxiety and I didn't even know it. I remember when I was a teenager and I was going to the doctor because I was getting these intense stomach aches. And I thought that there must be something wrong with me because I had them all the time. I had them in times when I was having a great time out with my friends. I was a super confident teenager. I was loving my life. I was involved in so many different things. And I remember having these stomach aches. And at that time, nobody was really talking about anxiety or talking about the impacts of stress. It was different. It was the early 90s and the mid 90s. And I didn't even know that it was anxiety, and neither did my doctor. I don't even remember a conversation with my doctor or with my parents that your stomach aches could be connected to anxiety, which for me now feels so obvious. But we can't have judgments on our past because we're not in our past anymore. So I'm just going to let that go and just remember that we didn't have the internet back then in that way. So we weren't talking about the conversations that we are now talking about in the 2000s and in 2024. It's just different. So I remember getting all these tests done when I was 15, 16. They were looking for stomach ulcers, and which again, we now know, of course, that stuff is connected to stress. So much of illness is connected to stress. I remember reading one statistic, and it was something like 94% of illness they can trace back to stress. But when I was a teenager, the response the doctor said is, we don't know. We have no idea what is causing these stomach aches, and the tests are not showing anything conclusive. So that was my adolescence. I had no sniff. Then when I got into my early 20s, I had just moved to a new city and I was recently married. And this is when the panic started. And I remember sitting at my kitchen table and I remember having this knowing feeling that I needed to spend time meditating and do more meditation than I had been doing. I knew it. It just, that knowing had dropped into my spirit. And guess what? I didn't do it. And that was one of my regrets into my 20s because I felt like that was a protective factor for me. If I had listened to that voice, if I had stepped into that knowing, I don't think that I would have had the panic disorder in the way that I did. Maybe it wouldn't have been as awful. Maybe it wouldn't have lasted as long. Maybe I would have developed skills. So it was more of a blip rather than this huge spike. I didn't do the meditation. And what had happened is, I don't even remember the first time I had a panic attack. But when I was experiencing panic, I couldn't think because my thoughts were racing and I would start shaking. I would get hot and cold. I would often start throwing up and my whole body would be shaking and I would be sweating and clammy and I would have these racing thoughts and it would just last. And I don't have a really good reference on time for how long it would last. Do you want to know the thing that would trigger the panic attacks is being alone at home. And I'm shaking my head if you're watching this on YouTube, because this is the most ridiculous thing. It doesn't even make sense. And this is why it doesn't make sense. I am a person who loves to be alone. And when I was a kid and would go away to summer camp, or would go away with friends, or would go to stay with my auntie for a week, I never phoned home. When I graduated from school, I moved to the other side of the country for a few months. And then the next part of the year, I moved down to the southern states for a few months. I went to Asia, and then I came back, and then I went to school on the East Coast. I did all of these things on my own without knowing people, because that kind of thing I loved and did not scare me in the least. I absolutely loved it. And this is why anxiety is so bizarre, because the thing that I was so comfortable with, the thing that I loved so much, was the trigger for my panic attacks. So at that time, my husband worked shift work and he would go away. So he would be gone for 4 days and then he would be home for 4 days. And we were newly married, living in a new city. And when he would go, I would have these full-on panic attacks. And I don't even know if it started when he was gone, because this is such a long time ago, because I remember having panic attacks when he was there. And I remember in later conversations, him saying like he just felt helpless, like he didn't even know what to do. And I didn't even know what to do. I was young. I didn't have the information or the understanding that I have now. And it was awful. And it took me a long time. So I think what happened is I started having panic attacks when he was around, and then I would have them more frequently when he was gone. And then I started to be concerned that I would have them when he was gone because he wasn't there. Not that he did anything when he was with me when I was having them. I mean, he felt helpless. I mean, he was there with me, which is a lot. It's not like it's nothing, but it wasn't that he was doing anything that it was actually changing the course of the panic attack. And so I think that I started to associate panicking when he wasn't there. So then I would have panic attacks all the time when he would leave, and most of the time at night. And it was pretty frequent. And I remember he's leaving within a block of 8 days, he's gone every 4. And these panic attacks of being alone lasted, I want to say it was almost a decade that I would get these. And it was so paralyzing because he continued to work away. Even when he worked other jobs, he would continue to have to leave. And I even remember having them after my daughter was born. So I'm a mom. I'm an adult. And I'm having these panic attacks. And the feeling was, I just felt so out of control. And it was awful. Like, it is horrendous. It is horrendous to have a panic attack, and it's horrendous to have anxiety. And now in retrospect, I can look back, I'm like, oh yeah, my baseline of anxiety while all that was going on was pretty high because I was concerned that I was going to have a panic attack. And sometimes my friends, when Jody would go away, they would come and just stay with me because I couldn't handle to be alone. And even when they were there, I still might have a panic attack. Or I would just go to my mom's house and I would stay with her. And I felt so trapped. I felt like a prisoner in my own mind and in my own body because I couldn't stop the way that my thoughts were racing, and I couldn't relax. And I was scared every time Jody was going to leave. And I was annoyed at myself because I knew then, just like I know now, that I love to be alone and I relish time by myself. So I was so annoyed that that time that I treasured was getting stolen from me. It was freaking awful. Oh, so glad to be through that and not have that anymore. And here's the thing. There were very few people in my life that knew this was going on for me. I told one of my sister-in-laws, one of my closest friends, because she would come and stay with me. Jody knew, and my mom and dad knew. I think that was it. I didn't even tell some of my other close friends. I didn't tell my extended family. And I've been contemplating why. Why didn't I want to talk about it? And part of me felt that giving voice to it would increase its control over me. And I felt so powerless at that time that it wasn't something that I felt that I could share. I didn't want to give it more power. I didn't want to give it more control. And I felt foolish, and I felt embarrassed, and I couldn't explain why it was happening to me, and I couldn't fix it, and I couldn't make it better. And I didn't want to give it any more power because I felt like it had so much power over me. So I didn't tell anyone. And I remember this one discussion with one of my closest friends, because we were at a party, and I think it was a party. I remember the conversation. I don't necessarily remember the location. And she was talking to me about how I never do things, how I don't go, they don't invite me on things anymore because I won't go. I won't go on the trip, or I don't spend time, going out of my way to maintain my relationship with them. And that was heartbreaking, because I knew that I had been excluded from that group of friends. And this was one of my closest friends for a very long time. And it was a very difficult conversation to hear. And I realized the impact that my panic disorder and the anxiety was having on my relationships, specifically my relationships that weren't even aware of what was going on for me. And that's what fear does. Can we just pause for a second and just acknowledge that that's what anxiety does to a person? It shrinks your world. It takes this beautiful, incredible life that you have in front of you, and it pulls away at it, and it makes it smaller and smaller. And the more you give into it, the more the fear grows and the anxiety grows, the more control it has, the more power it has, the smaller and smaller your world gets. My friend thought that the reason why I wasn't doing things was because I just didn't have time for her. Meanwhile, the reason why is I was scared that if I went away on a trip with them, that I would have a panic attack, and that doesn't sound fun to me. It didn't sound appealing to be concerned or scared that that would happen. So I told her. I told her that I had been experiencing anxiety and what that was like for me. And she loved me anyways. Of course she loved me. She's a person who loves me. But when I was able to tell her about it, it released this freedom in our relationship. She understood why I had behaved the way I had behaved. She understood why I had said the things I had said and done the things that I had done in our relationship. And it created space for healing. And I'm happy to say that since that conversation, we've actually gone on a trip together, just the two of us, and I had a wonderful time. And I didn't have a panic attack. I mean, this trip was quite a bit later from when it happened, but it is a very happy memory for me to think that we had gone on this trip, because so much was stolen from me when I was experiencing the anxiety and when I was experiencing the panic. It totally shaped my relationships, and it dictated the things that I felt like I could do. It was awful. And having breakthrough from it was everything. It was so liberating. I spent a lot of time meditating, and that was one of the ways that I got freedom. I also, towards the end of when I was experiencing the panic, that's when I was doing my master's in counseling psych. So through the material that I was studying and through the process of becoming a counselor and working in mental health, I was able to take the things that I was learning and apply to it. I didn't even get professional help. Like now that I'm a counselor and in retrospect, I'm like, what was I thinking? Because therapists, mental health therapists that are good, they know how to work with anxiety. They can make a huge difference. But I think I just felt scared that this thing that was controlling me, I didn't want to give it any more power. And I felt like if I went for help for it, I was making it bigger. And I didn't want it to be any bigger. I just wanted it to go away. And I just wanted it to be small. And I was tired and I was disappointed in myself. It's weird to be a person who's used to having a lot of control, to have no control over what your body's doing. And what I've learned now is the way that we experience anxiety in our bodies is quite different. When I was having the panic attacks, I had racing thoughts. I experience anxiety in other ways. I don't always have racing thoughts. Sometimes my reaction to anxiety, my reaction to stress, that is an anxious response, can be completely physical and not mental at all. And it's important to learn how we as individuals are responding and to come up with ways to counter it. Because as I said early on, we're all going to experience stress. And if our response is an anxious response, we need to find ways to reduce our anxiety and to increase our peace. And I have a worksheet that we developed when I did a previous episode on stress. And you can download this freebie worksheet. It's like an information sheet about stress and anxiety. And I love it. It's the way that I've thought about stress and anxiety for a very long time. And you can get that at amymckinnis.ca freebies. We'll show the link on the YouTube. And it gives strategies for how to increase peace. Because when we are countering anxiety, when we're in situations, when we're in a lot of stress, or we know we're going into a situation where there's going to be a lot of stress, we can be proactive to do things to increase our peace and to do things to decrease our anxiety. And there's so many activities that actually do both of those things, that decrease anxiety and increase peace at the same time. These are skills that anxious people that are prone to anxiety, these skills are really helpful and they can really make a difference. One of the ways that I've heard different people within the psychology field talk about anxiety is that if you're anxious, you're always going to be anxious. It's just the way you are. And I'm really resistant to that. And the reason why, in part, that I'm so resistant to that idea that we'll never be free is because I don't like absolutes and I don't like things like never be free. That sounds horrendous to me. The other thing that I know is that sometimes my feelings of anxiety are not my own. I'm just picking up on what's in the room. So as an intuitive, empathic person, sometimes I get in spaces and I can feel other people's anxiety. And when I was full-blown having panic attacks and full-blown experiencing anxiety on a regular basis, I could not discern or distinguish when it was somebody else's anxiety that I was picking up on or when it was my anxiety or something that I was feeling. And now that I'm no longer having panic attacks and I'm not really an anxious person, not to say that I don't experience anxiety, because I definitely do at times, It's just not an current. It's not an undercurrent that's always in my life. But what I notice is that when I know that the anxiety is not my own and I'm picking it up in the room or I'm picking it up in the situation, I approach it completely different than if it's my experience. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that you might be feeling anxious and it might not have anything to do with you. Can I share a few quick tips for things that saved me? Tips that saved me from the panic and from the anxious. And you hear me talk about this stuff because I apply these tips to many different types of situations. But the first one for panic is just ride the wave. When I would have a panic attack, one of the things that helped them stop for me was the recognition that it's not going to last. They always end. Just keep breathing. Just wait it out. And I got really good at waiting it out. When you know it's going to end, when you know the panic is going to stop, you just ride it out. You just keep breathing because the end is coming. And having that knowledge that the end is coming creates some type of peace in you that counters the panic. So that was a tip, knowing that it was going to end, knowing that I needed to just ride it out. And what I found is once I understood that, and once I started to apply that thinking in the moment of the panic attacks got a lot shorter, so they were faster, and eventually they just stopped. So that was one thing. The other thing that I did was I looked at the lies that I was believing, the things that were creating the anxiety, the thoughts that I was having, because remember I was saying that I had all these anxious thoughts that I couldn't get control of. I looked at the thoughts that I was believing and I looked for things or evidence of what was the opposite that could be true. So what countered that lie? And instead of just thinking those things, because it's not as effective to fight a thought with a thought, especially when it's your own thought, but I would fight it with saying it out loud. So I thought of statements that I believed to be true that were counter to the thinking that was the anxious thoughts, and I would speak those to myself, and I would meditate on those thoughts, not just in the moment of anxiety, but I thought about them all the time. And then I would meditate. So I would often listen to Psalms, which is like a book from the Bible. And I would just read those or listen to those. And I found that as a meditation was super helpful for me. So those are the three things that I did to counter it. And then in the meantime, I looked for ways to reduce my anxiety, increase my peace, and I worked hard to not put myself in positions of stress when I felt anxiety. The other thing that I think is so interesting about anxiety is so much of it is about control. And when I say like, just let it go, ride the wave, that's the opposite of trying to hold on so tight. You're just letting it be. You're just releasing it and letting it happen. And when I was able to do the release, that's when things got quicker. That's when it started to go away. As I was thinking about this episode this morning, when I was thinking about sharing this and talking about anxiety and talking about stress, I was realizing how many people struggle with anxiety. And for me, sharing my experiences with panic and sharing my experiences with having an anxiety disorder, I'm doing this because I want you to know that if you are experiencing that, there are ways out. You don't have to be that way. If I can do it, you can do it. If I was able to come through that, you are able to come through that. And that's what this episode is about. And that's what this podcast is about. And I would love to hear your stories of where you have gained freedom. If you would share those with me, it would warm my heart because something miraculous happens when we share our breakthroughs, it not only does it reinforce that we had a breakthrough, but it builds hope up in others. Because when we hear about other people doing things, we think to ourselves, oh, I can do it. If they can do it, I can do it. If she did it, I can do it. It gives hope and it builds hope. So I would love to hear your stories. I would love for you to share your stories. And for those of you who you don't have a story of victory yet, you don't have a story of breakthrough, I've been wondering if I should be creating a course for people who are struggling with anxiety. When I was working in mental health before, I used to do workshops for parents where they could come and learn all about anxiety. And I did groups for parents of kids who had anxiety. And I just think this is such a relevant topic. And even with our staff, with one of our businesses, we did a whole challenge for the staff team around increasing ways to cope with stress. And it was such a fun challenge. I absolutely loved it. So that's my question for you, all my listeners out there, is this a course that you think you would be interested in taking? Is this something that you know a person who is experiencing anxiety and you think they would benefit from learning more about it and learning some strategies? If this is resonating with you, would you please send me a message or respond to me? You can go to my website. There's a place, amymckinnis.ca, where you can, I think there's a place, I'm sure there is, where you can send me a message. So if this is something of interest to you, because I would love to know if this is speaking to you and if you would like more material like this, because then I know that I'm serving my audience, which is important to me. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for listening to a story that is one that I never told for a very long time, and I still have never told in public until today. Thank you for listening. It isn't easy to share difficult things, and if this spoke to you, I would love to hear that. So please rate, please subscribe. And if you know that this message is for somebody because you know somebody struggling, please share it. I want to see more people free from anxiety. This is The Art of Plenty. My name is Amy McInnes, and I no longer have